Good afternoon. My name is Doug Elliott, and it's my honor to serve as Kootenai Electric's General Manager and CEO. I hope you're enjoying this tour of the cooperative's new headquarters and learning how it's central to providing you the service that you expect from us. Each year at the annual meeting, I provide our members an update on the operations of the cooperative, and this year is no different. What is different is how I'm delivering it. In lieu of an in-person presentation during the business portion of our meeting, I've chosen to instead offer it via this video as a stop on your tour today. There are a couple reasons for this. First, it's an effective use of the technology and display of the technology that we use every day to serve you. As with most businesses, the utility world is increasingly a digital one. Secondly, this presentation can be shared with members who may not be in attendance today. In fact, increasingly so, fewer members are participating in the business portion of the meeting being held as part of our annual meeting. This approach allows any member to view this presentation at their leisure from the comforts of their own home at a later date, or, in your case, in this room right now. And finally, perhaps most significant to me, preparing this in advance allows me more time to network with each of you personally during your time with us today. I look forward to the opportunity and hope to connect with you while you're here today. For my update this year, I'd like to focus on three aspects of our operations. First, I'll summarize our financial performance for the year just completed. Next, I'd like to provide you an update on power supply in the Pacific Northwest and the cost pressures that this is creating for customers of all regional utilities. I'll also share what KEC is doing to best safeguard its customers, each of you, from those pressures. And finally, I'll close with some other highlights of major projects ongoing at KEC. So let's begin with our financial performance during 2023. KEC closed the year with revenues of $61.7 million. And from this, KEC used $23.5 million to purchase or produce power on behalf of its members. An additional $10.1 million was incurred in operating and maintaining the cooperative's infrastructure used to deliver that power to you. $8.4 million was used to provide the customer service and support you expect. Also included in this amount is the cost of other administrative functions like accounting, IT, human resources, and the like. The cooperative incurred $12.4 million in fixed expenses. Now, fixed expenses include the interest that we pay on our long-term debt and the depreciation on plant. And we also pay a small amount of expenses in taxes. Net margins reflect the revenues that remain after all other expenses are paid. These margins are allocated back to our members in the form of patronage capital and are returned to you after the board determines that they're no longer necessary to maintain the financial health of the cooperative. Notably, net margins reflect the equity our members have in the cooperative. The banks we borrow from rely on that equity to extend favorable interest rates, which are necessary to keep our rates as low as possible. Net margins during 2023 were $5.7 million. All in all, KEC had a very favorable financial year during 2023. Now, I'd like to shift our focus to power supply in the Pacific Northwest and the cost pressures it's creating for the customers of all regional utilities. But before departing this slide, I'd like to call your attention to the obvious. The cost of power represents the single largest expense the cooperative incurs in providing service to you. Out of every $100 our members pay in retail rates, $38.17 was used to purchase or produce power on their behalf or your behalf. This amount was artificially lower during 2023 than as usual. The reason for this is that BPA over-collected money from its customers under a financial reserves policy. During 2023, BPA returned some of those funds to their customers, of which KEC is one. KEC received over $3.1 million from this. While this was a welcome outcome, it artificially resulted in lower apparent costs for power during the year. Absent this return, our power supply costs would have been 13% higher than they were. Recognizing that the cost of power represents about 40% of our total revenues, not receiving this would have required our rates to be 5% higher than they actually were. While that may sound alarming, it's really distracting to the main issue driving the cost of power in the Pacific Northwest, and therefore the rates that our customers pay. That story begins with growth. Growth that KEC is experiencing locally, and much more significantly, growth that the Northwest is experiencing at large. So it comes as no surprise that KEC is growing, right? This slide shows the number of new member extensions the cooperative has made year over the past 2.5 decades. Notably, despite high interest rates for new home and business loans, KEC extended service to a record number of new services during 2023. In total, we added more than 1,400 new services during the year. This increases the amount of power KEC needs to purchase or produce. But while local growth is certainly adding to the cost of power, it's not the real story. Our growth is just a subplot of a much larger story playing out across the Pacific Northwest. To understand the factors dictating the rising cost of power which KEC and every other utility in the Pacific Northwest is experiencing requires an understanding of that larger story. So just as KEC is experiencing growth, so too has the Pacific Northwest as a whole. Consider this chart. It depicts the historical and forecasted load in the Pacific Northwest. It was prepared by the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, or referred to as the NWPCC, and was included in their 6th Power Plan that was published in 2019. Back then, it envisioned load growth continuing well into the future. Actual load growth, on the other hand, has outpaced these projections, all of these projections. So you might be asking yourself, what's driving this growth? Well, I'm really glad you asked. There are many factors. First, environmental policies compelling or even incenting the electrification of the transportation industry. It used to be that the siting of an EV was reserved for the big city. However, just a few months ago, as is the custom, my wife and I were eating breakfast at the Blue Plate, an establishment whose clientele is as salt of the earth as they come, and where the phrase, "everyone knows your name," could not be more true. As we left, I counted no less than 3 EVs in the parking lot. It wasn't too many years ago that none of my Blue Plate friends, let alone myself, could even identify what an EV looked like. EVs are here and they're everywhere. They're part of our community, and despite your feelings or mine about them, they're certainly increasing the consumption and placing additional demand on the electric grid. Next are carbon reduction policies enacted by our friends to the west in an ambition to reduce emissions. The state of Washington, for instance, has enacted legislation requiring that new residential and commercial buildings be heated with electricity. Additionally, the water used within these buildings must also be heated with electricity, and this too has increased electrical consumption and demand on the grid. Consider the proliferation of artificial intelligence and the interconnectedness of everything from our phones, our cars, and even our toothbrushes. This interconnectedness has created a need for additional data centers that have ravenous appetites for electric power. And finally, electrical conservation efforts have reached a point of diminishing returns. Most of the easy conservation efforts have already been implemented. As electrical consumption is increasing due to these many factors, paradoxically, the construction of new power generation resources has been stagnant. In fact, some power generation resources are even being taken offline. As a nation, we are expeditiously, if not recklessly, eliminating carbon-based generation from our portfolio of power production. There are many who would like to see the 4 lower Snake River dams removed to potentially restore native fish populations. Well, I can't speak for the fish, but I can certainly speak for the humans and the members in which we serve. The hydro resources of the Pacific Northwest, and in particular the 4 lower Snake River dams, play a crucial and central role in the production of power in the Pacific Northwest. I'll share more about that in just a minute. But finally, the resources that we are building in the Pacific Northwest are primarily renewable. Examples of this include wind and solar. Now, those resources are valuable, but they only produce power when the wind blows or the sun shines. They cannot be called on to produce more power when you and I may require it. Unlike hydro and natural gas, these resources, wind and solar, only produce when the conditions are right. And those resources are no respecter of when you and I may want to use that power. So, how did all these factors conspire together during the recent cold snap the region experienced in January of this year? Well, consider the following map. During the January 2024 cold snap, the Pacific Northwest was short 5 gigawatts of production. This is about 5 times the total capacity of the Columbia Generating Station, the region's only functioning nuclear reactor. To compensate for this, BPA imported 5 gigawatts of power from the desert Southwest. That power was wheeled across high-voltage transmission lines through California, otherwise known as the CAL-ISO, or the California Independent System Operator. This power was imported into the CAL-ISO for $200 a megawatt hour and exported milliseconds later for $1,000 a megawatt hour. Over the span of 5 days, the CAL-ISO arbitraged about $120 million in wheeling charges, or more technically called congestion charges. Notably, the interchange between the CAL-ISO and BPA was maxed out. It could not have handled any additional power transfers. This was one of the reasons why prices were so high during that time span. Those congestion charges are designed to help pay for upgrades to those facilities to ensure congestion does not remain an impediment to power flows. Equally of note, the wind was not blowing, and it was the coldest at night. Wind and solar production contributed negligible amounts of energy during this time frame, but hydro did. Production from the 4 lower Snake River dams was increased during this time frame to compensate for the underperformance of these other renewable resources. They literally saved our bacon. Absent them, the grid would have suffered rolling blackouts at a time when electrical power was the most crucial. Now, the good news is that the grid performed really well during this heavy loading. But the bad news is that it almost didn't. And the reality is, and the moral of the story that I'm telling you, is that we desperately need to build additional power generation and transmission in the Pacific Northwest. And we as an industry and we as a country are falling woefully short. Stated in plain terms, demand is outpacing supply. And as our economics professor taught us, this predictably leads to increased prices. And given the rate of growth in the region, coupled with the removal of carbon-emitting generation and the amount of time it requires to build power plants, these pressures will be felt for years to come through rates. This chart reflects the forecasted effect these pressures will have on KEC over the next few decades. I won't take time to fully explain all the colors and annotations. It's really not necessary to drive home the point that I'm making. All that is necessary is an observation of the top of the curve. It reflects the volume of energy KEC will need to secure over the next 30 some odd years. KEC will need to buy increasing amounts of power at rates that are heavily influenced by supply constraints. The effect that this will have on electric rates is obvious. Our single largest expense is forecasted to increase by 25% over the next 3 years. It's forecasted to increase by 100% over the next 9. As reflected in these headlines, this is a reality playing out at every growing utility in the Pacific Northwest. Our rates are unfortunately a reflection of the same reality. So what's KEC doing about all of this? Well, we recently joined a power generation cooperative, structured much like Kootenai Electric is a cooperative, that's owned by 17 other electric cooperatives having similar power generation needs as we have. So individually, we don't have sufficient scale to economically develop a generation resource on our own, but collectively, we are much better poised to do so. And in doing so, we benefit from aggregation and the diversification of our power portfolio. We've also implemented a demand response system that reduces our system voltage and therefore our load. During those times when our system load and the cost of power is the highest, through this program, the cooperative saved over $200,000 in power supply costs without imposition to our customers. Next, we're evaluating our member extension policies and will likely be increasing the costs paid by those newly connecting to our system in the future. And finally, we're evaluating our retail rate structure to ensure it creates correct pricing signals for our members. For example, we want our rates to incent charging EVs at night when the cost of power is the lowest and when the system is not peaking. At the same time, we want to ensure our rates remain straightforward and uncomplicated. Now, let's shift our focus to other work the cooperative is doing on your behalf. Wildfire mitigation and ensuring system reliability are two areas of significant investment for the cooperative. This chart shows the investments that the cooperative has made in these areas over the past 4 years. To be blunt, wildfire mitigation and hardening the system from potential impact of a wildfire are paramount and existential threats to our operations, which we take very seriously. When clearing vegetation from our easements and rights-of-way, we are necessarily merciless. Any tree growing within 15 feet of either side of the power line is now being removed without question, regardless of how old or sentimentally significant it may be. We have no choice in the matter. Responsible utility management demands we remove these trees due to the considerable risk of electrically induced wildfire. Our spending on general line maintenance has also increased over the past 4 years. This is the product of a more aggressive and methodical approach to system maintenance, coupled with the rising cost of material and labor. The product of these efforts is clear and evident. Over these same 4 years, our outage-related expense has continuously decreased. Our system reliability has increased. And we have had no wildfire starts due to electrical equipment failure. Despite all these good outcomes, more needs to be done, and we will continue to pursue these efforts diligently until that is no longer the case. Another tool we have in reducing wildfire risk and improving reliability is overhead to underground line conversions. So last year I reported that KEC had received a grant to convert the overhead power lines in the Spirit Lake East subdivision to underground, and that work is now well underway. Once completed, KEC will have replaced 23 miles of overhead line with 30 miles of underground. The grant we received will fund 90% of this cost, with KEC paying the balance. The total cost of this construction is in excess of $10 million. To date, 60% of that work has been completed, with the balance of that work being completed by year's end or perhaps by even the end of summer. This work will significantly increase the reliability for those living in this subdivision and will reduce the risk of wildfire. And when faced with widespread outages on our system, this work will free up the crews that would have normally been needed to restore power in this subdivision to instead assist with the restoration of power in other areas of our system. Or stated differently, as a result of this work, all of our members' power will be restored much more quickly. Earlier this year, we launched a new series of educational articles in our power lines. Through this series, I strive to provide our members with a well-rounded understanding of our utility and the issues that are driving the policy decisions the cooperative makes. Through them, I discuss such topics as what is a cooperative, where we get our power from, how the electric grid operates, the differences in dispatchable and non-dispatchable generation, the role Bonneville Power Administration plays in our wholesale power supply, electric rate designs and the reason for those designs, such as the service availability charge and demand charges, and much more. The need for this series of articles became clear to me through an analysis the cooperative completed late last year. Historically, members of cooperatives have remained members for long periods of time, but due to our growth, we wanted to test whether this hypothesis remained true. It turns out that our membership has become much more transitory over the past few years. In fact, 40% of our members have been members for 5 years or less. Another 20% of our members have been members for 6 years to 10 years. With 60% of our membership being relatively new to KEC, I felt it was essential to communicate more directly about these important topics which all members should be aware of. I hope you've seen these articles and have learned something interesting from them. And if you haven't, I encourage you to go to our website and view them in our past power lines, which can be found there. Last year, the cooperative also completed the construction of this headquarters facility, which you're touring today. Following the completion of that construction, we moved our entire operations from the Hayden headquarters to the Rathdrum headquarters over one really long weekend. It was an all-hands-on-deck event. Last year, we also consummated the sale of our Fighting Creek landfill gas-to-energy plant to the company who's been operating it from us. This plant required considerable staff time to support and essentially operate at a cost. Divesting the plant allows the cooperative to focus more on other important work that we're doing on your behalf. Now, this isn't to say that Fighting Creek won't become a resource KEC relies on to serve that growing appetite for power that we have. However, through our new relationship with PNGC, our power supply cooperative, we would instead enter into a purchase and sales agreement for the output of that plant in lieu of being its sole owner. Doing so is like getting all of the rewards without the many risks. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us, or if you're watching this video on your own subsequent to our annual meeting, thank you for your interest in the cooperative. We really appreciate you and work hard to serve you. If there's anything that we can do better to serve you, we'd like to know it. Please feel free to reach out to me. You can find my contact information on our website, or better yet, corner me today. I'll be spending my day engaging with members and would value hearing from you directly. I hope you enjoy the rest of your tour and the other activities we have planned for you. Thanks and have a great day.